All right. So today we're going to talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendego. Obviously, it's a very well-known story. It's one of my personal favorites. But before we jump right into it, I want to go back some and get to know these guys and who they were, where they came from, and what led them to this point. If we go back to Daniel 1, it starts off telling us about King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. He came to Jerusalem and besieged it. He took over. And the city, as well as the temple, was destroyed. And the articles of the temple and its treasures were carried off back to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to also bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility back to Babylon. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. They would be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. So he did as he was told. He took the best and the brightest of Jerusalem's young men back to Babylon. Among those men were 4 men: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The head of the palace staff gave them new names, Babylonian names. So Daniel was now Belshazzar, Hananiah was named Shadrach, Mishael was named Meshach, and Azariah was named Abendego. The king then ordered that these men brought to Babylon would be served from the same menu as the royal table, the best food, the finest wine. But Daniel 1:11 goes on to tell us that Daniel didn't want to partake in that food. He was able to talk to his steward and request to be on a simple diet of vegetables and water. The steward warned him that the king may not like that, and that at the end of it, they may end up weaker than all the other people who have been eating the good stuff. So Daniel asked them to give them a try. For 10 days, just give us vegetables and water, and let's see what happens, and see if what you're saying is true. Just try us out. So they agreed to do it. Daniel was concerned about defiling himself by eating food that was not slain in accordance with Jewish law, that had been offered as a sacrifice to idols, or that was forbidden by Old Testament law. So he chose to remain faithful to God and not go against his law by eating this unclean food. The steward agreed to do it and fed them vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the other ones who had been eating from the royal menu. So the steward continued to exempt them from the royal menu of food and drink and serve them only vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave, you can sit there, that's just my stuff. To these 4 men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams. At the end of the time set by the king for their training, the head of the royal staff brought them to King Nebuchadnezzar. And that's when King Nebuchadnezzar would see who's best fit to come join the service after these 3 years of training. So when the king interviewed them, he found them far superior to all the other young men. None were a match for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they took their place in the king's service among the most trusted wise men and counselors. So then, in Daniel 2, we read about how King Nebuchadnezzar started having dreams that were disturbing him. He couldn't sleep, so he called all the Babylonian magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, fortune tellers, to try to get someone to interpret this dream for him. But none of them could. They all failed. But Daniel prayed that the Lord would reveal, and then he proved to be the only man who was able to interpret the king's dream. The king then placed him at a high position over the whole province of Babylon, including all of the wise men and the land. And at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as administrators under Daniel. So that's what we've read from, or that's what we learned from Daniel 1 to Daniel 2. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel were all Israelites who lived in Jerusalem. They were captured by the Babylonians and forced into this new culture and way of living, where they would be trained to work for the king, and in the end, they were promoted to high positions. That's what we know so far. So in all this, they could have been angry. They could have chosen to be upset with God for allowing this to happen. Imagine being somewhere and taken from your home, right? Because Jerusalem was home to them, to these Israelites, right? So imagine being forced out of that into this new city, this new place, forced to be trained to work for this king. Like, this is all new. You were just ripped from what you know and thrown into this place. They had much reason to be angry. They could have been. We all know that couldn't have been easy, but they chose to remain faithful and obey God. So now this leads us to Daniel 3, which is our focus for today. So as we read before, Lieutenant read, King Nebuchadnezzar built a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet thick, and commanded all the people to fall down and worship it whenever they heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and other musical instruments. Anyone who failed to bow and worship this image would be thrown into an immense blazing furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendego were determined to worship the one true God only, in spite of it all, so they did not bow. And of course, were then reported to the king, but courageously they stood before him as the king pressured the men to deny their God again. And verses 16 to 28 tell us how they responded, saying, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown in the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." These men were so faithful to their God, who they knew could deliver them from any situation. These Israelites had already seen God's faithfulness before, and they knew that it was their duty to be faithful to him. So we see King Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue and commands everybody to bow down to it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego choose to obey God regardless of the outcome. Then what happens next? The king punishes them by throwing them into the fiery furnace. The Bible tells us that the king was so furious, he had the furnace heated 7 times more than normal for these men, because he was so angry. But then verse 20 to 23 tell us that the king ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing fire. So they did. The 3 men were fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot furnace, the flames killed the soldiers just from throwing them in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. Can you imagine that? That the flames killed the soldiers from just throwing the men in. Imagine being in the actual furnace, right? That just showed and proved that that furnace was not survivable. Like, no one could have made it in that furnace and lived a second. Like, they died from just throwing the men in. They were outside of it, and they died, all the soldiers. So that just proves that they were meant to die in that furnace. So not only did the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego survive, but the Bible tells us that they came out with not a hair on their heads singed, their clothing was not scorched, and they didn't even smell of smoke. King Nebuchadnezzar looked in the furnace and realized something crazy. "Look," he shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Once he called them out, he said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." He sent his angels to rescue his servants who trusted him. They defied the king's commands and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god but their own. Therefore I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb by limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Amen. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. So again, King Nebuchadnezzar builds this statue. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego choose to obey God regardless of anything. Now the king punishes them, but then we see that God delivers them. So how can that apply to us? What can we learn from this story that's so well known that we always hear and we're like, wow, it's so good. But how can we apply it to us? The first thing is, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm, even in the face of death. And in that same way, we need to be able to stand firm at all times. We must never compromise what's taught in the Bible, and we must obey God over men when there's opposing interests.
Right.
Men never come first. Man never comes first, not men. I mean, men did. I'm just kidding. Man never comes first. God always comes first. So whenever there's opposing interests, we choose God. So what does that look for us? Sure, maybe there's not literally a statue that we're being forced to bow down to or we'll die. But look at the world around us. How often are we put in situations that could compromise our faith? I can't help but be reminded of the Oregon shooting or the many other attacks against Christians. And that very well could have been any of us, right? But can we say that we're at a place in our faith that we're willing to trust God, stand firm in what we know is the truth, even in the face of death? Not just when everything's going great and God's just blessing us and everything feels like roses and daisies. In the face of death, can we say that we'd be willing to stand firm for God and still be faithful? This also reminds me of Daniel in the lion's den, which Lieutenant preached about a few weeks back. Daniel's faith in God, just like these three men, was undeniable. He was thrown in a den with starved lions because of his faith and obedience to God. But God delivered him. It's not that the lions chose not to devour him. Nah, not him. He doesn't look tasty enough. That wasn't the case. It's not that they chose to do that. It's that the Lord shut their mouths so that they wouldn't be able to. When the king came and saw Daniel the next morning and saw that he was alive, he helped him out the pit and ordered the men and their families who accused Daniel to be thrown in with the lions. And the Bible tells us that they had not even touched the ground by the time the lions tore at them and began eating them. The lions didn't leave Daniel alone because they were not hungry. They left him alone because God refused to eat them. I mean, to let them eat them. Why? Because he was faithful. We can't expect God to be faithful to us if we're not faithful to him. And that means obeying him above all else. The second thing we can learn from this is that as a result of our faith and our obedience, God is going to show us favor. And others will be able to recognize the goodness of God through us. When King Nebuchadnezzar saw what God did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he realized the greatness of God. Not only that, but it led to a promotion for these men, right? God is faithful to us if we are faithful to him. And his favor will be upon us. We should be encouraged to stand strong in our faith like these men, so that others, if nothing else, so that others can see God through us. I believe they didn't expect to get a promotion after this. They didn't do it for that. But if nothing else, they stood firm in God and in what they knew was true. And if nothing else, people got to recognize God through them. And we should be encouraged to stand strong in the same way so that God's glory can be shown to everyone. And then the last thing I want us to take away from this is that through life's fiery trials, God will never leave us. We must trust and believe in his promises. In Isaiah 43, verses 1 to 3, it says, "But now, O Jacob, listen to the Lord who created you. O Israel, the one who formed you says, do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you, for I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." We know that God is able to deliver us. However, we also know that he doesn't always do it that way. Romans 5:3-5 says, We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment, for we know how dearly God loves us, because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with his love.
Amen.
This tells us that God may allow trials and difficulties in our lives to build our character, strengthen our faith, or for reasons unknown to us. We may not always understand the purpose of our trials, but God simply asks that we trust him, even when it's not easy. Some of us expect that the miracle is outside of the fire. We think that God is going to save us before things went that far, because we serve this God who's just so gracious. He won't even let us have to go through that. He's going to save us before that even has to happen. But for some of us, the miracle is in the fire. The fire is necessary. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what if they never went into the fire? We don't know if King Nebuchadnezzar would have ever gotten to know the greatness of this God. You know, that was what happened. They had to be thrown into that furnace for people to see God. You can even imagine, even us as believers, if we were in that situation and we know there's 3 men in this furnace, and suddenly we see a 4th one that looks like an angel, even we would be blown away. And we know that God is able, but even we would be surprised. So imagine King Nebuchadnezzar, who wasn't even a true believer of God at all, and then he sees this, and that's what it took for him to know the greatness of God. So God's glory was shown through that situation. The king came to see God's power, and because of his decree, the whole city was exposed to God. So not only did King Nebuchadnezzar now know God, but because he knew that this God is real, only he could do that. Nobody could have done that. So now he says to everyone that they must never speak bad about this God, because this God is real. So now, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was in this crazy situation where they got thrown into this furnace that could have gone really bad, God delivered them, and through that, God's glory was shown, not just to King Nebuchadnezzar, but because it was shown to King Nebuchadnezzar, now the whole city was exposed to God. All through that one thing, that one fiery furnace that could have gone a completely different way, but because they were faithful to God, they trusted God, they obeyed God, God ended up being victorious in that. So, I want to encourage you guys to look at this story differently. This story, again, that we've all heard. But the same God that delivered these men is the same God we serve today. So, in a few minutes, I'm going to give you guys a moment to just reflect and pray, but I encourage you guys to take a look at yourselves and your walk with God, your faith, and your faithfulness to God. I think we can all agree, and I hope that we can all agree, that we serve a God who's faithful. But we cannot expect that if we're not faithful to him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were faithful and obedient to God, regardless of whether or not God would deliver them. They trusted God to be all that he said he is, and they chose to be faithful to him. And so then God was faithful to them. Do you trust God enough to be faithful and obedient to him, even when all the odds are against you? Even when the outcome could be death? If not, then I would encourage you to take some time now when I give you guys just some time to reflect and speak to God. What's stopping you from being completely faithful? Is it lack of trust? Is it fear? And if it is, please know that Jesus died so that we don't have to fear. We don't have to be bound or controlled by fear. We don't have to fear death. We don't have to fear anything. Imagine if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or even Daniel and lion's den would have let fear control them. What if in that moment they would have said, I'm not getting into that fire. I'm going to do whatever this king says. Even if afterwards they're like, God, I'm so sorry. I should have done differently. But what if they would have in that moment been consumed by fear, which I think all of us have had moments where we're just consumed by fear and we choose against something that we know we shouldn't have. imagine, none of all the victory that happened at the end would have been able to happen. None of it was possible if they would have been consumed by fear. But they chose not to. They chose to stand firm in the God they believed in and remain faithful because they knew their God would come through for them. Like I said, that's the same God we serve today. So we should be confident in knowing that in any situation, God's going to come through for us. And so we don't have to be consumed by fear of anything because God is always going to come through for us in the end.